We're talking about preposition at the end. End of what? We're talking about at the end of sentences. Okay, you might have heard something like this. Don't end the proposition with a preposition. Okay, that means don't end a sentence, a statement, with a preposition as the last word in your sentence. It's considered a grammatical rule, kind of a traditional thing, but this is not a really hard set rule. A lot of sitcoms, comedy shows make jokes about it where an English teacher is being really picky about the preposition at the end. But this is not a really solid rule, and when you try to follow this rule, you get into a lot of problems also. So it is something you should be aware of, so let's cover it real quick. Let's look at the sentence here. That is the page that we were referring to. So this is the kind of sentence that we're thinking about. That's the page. And that we were referring to, this is called a clause here, from that to the to. And this clause, this group of words, refers to what the page is. What page are we talking about? The page that we were referring to. And there's a sentence embedded in here. And the sentence is that we, subject, were referring to that. To that would be the page. So the sentence is, we were referring to the page. So there's a complete sentence embedded in there. And because we want this that next to the page, in order to connect them, we end up leaving this to at the end, even though we mean to say to that. And that's why they tell you don't leave that to hanging there, because that to really goes with the that as one prepositional phrase. And they shouldn't be separated out that way. Probably because it looks ugly in some cases, but functionally what happens is if you leave them apart like that, the clause that goes in the middle can be so long that you lose track of which word goes with which and what the logic of that particular sentence was. So better for that case might be the next version. That is the page to which we were referring. And so you would have clause here where you have to which as the connection there, the to being in the front with the word which as one prepositional phrase, and that is considered better. It is better in the sense that if you're doing formal writing, we expect to see something like that. This is not better when you're speaking. Okay? So, not used in conversational speech. In speech, we would say something like this. Hey, that is the man I was talking to. And here we have the same thing. We have a clause here. So the main sentence says, that's the man. Okay, that's a full, complete sentence. And I want to tell something more about which man I was talking to. So I say, man I was talking to. And in between is really, there is a connector here, a subordinating conjunction that, which goes right there, but it's omitted in this sentence. And that is allowed in this kind of syntax, this arrangement. Okay, so let's not worry about that for now. But in normal speech, we would leave this to at the end, and there's no problem. Okay, so in your writing too, in a lot of sentences, if you want to sound natural, you would have to do that. Because if you switch it, you will get something like the next sentence. That is the man to whom I was talking. And we wouldn't talk that way, okay? And it would only be someone trying to be very formal, perhaps, making an effort to sound formal might do that, but typical conversational situations do not require that kind of formality. So one thing we might want to note is that not all prepositions are the same, okay? Just because you see a preposition or what looks like a preposition doesn't mean it's the same kind of preposition you find in prepositional phrases. Sometimes they could be just straightforward adverbs just by itself and not having an object to go with it. Or they could be part of something called prepositional verbs or phrasal verbs. Okay, it could be, a component in a different kind of structure. So let's consider prepositional verbs. It's something like this. They are listening to terrible music. This is considered a prepositional verb in the sense that this really functions as the verb together. Okay, it's not really that they are listening and then to terrible music, but it's more like they're listening to, consider it as one verb, and then the object, what is it that they're listening to, would be the terrible music. Okay, so we call those prepositional verbs. We won't get too much into that now, but let's consider, if we consider this a prepositional phrase, like so, and we wanted to consider what happens to that preposition in different positions. Let's look at the next sentence. That is terrible music that they are listening to. Hey, that sounds pretty good. That's terrible music that they're listening to. That sounds normal, natural, so this one, okay. And check mark, of course, in America means it's good. I found out that in other countries, a check mark is actually bad, and that it means it's wrong. Okay, but here my check mark means it's good. That is terrible music to which they are listening. All right, if you force yourself to put the to in the front to go with the to which, like so, because you don't want that proposition ending with a preposition, okay, you put it up here and then you end with the listening. But look at what happened. That is terrible music to which they're listening. Okay, the listening doesn't have quite the same meaning, or it doesn't have that same impression if you don't have the to next to it. Because when we're speaking, we generally consider listening to as one set, like that has itself one meaning. So if we separate it out this way, it doesn't quite work. But I'm sure there are plenty of writers who's going to do this because they're trying to follow that rule of not leaving the preposition at the end. So either way, you could do, in those cases, that's fine. But let's consider something else here. Different sentence. Let's see. The report is based on many interviews he had listened to. All right, that sounds pretty good. All right, he listened to, and I like that preposition at the end to go with the listened. How about the next one? The report is based on many interviews to which he had listened. All right, that sounds formal. A lot of writers will try to do that just to sound more formal. All right, I would say, okay, that's acceptable, okay, because any reader is going to understand it, and they're going to say, oh, you did a good job, separating that to make sure it doesn't stay at the end. But technically, it should stay at the end in that case. How about phrasal verbs? Phrasal verbs are verbs that go with the another preposition, or what looks like a preposition, but it's actually just one phrase. It's one verb, just like the prepositional verbs. One difference between the prepositional verb and the phrasal verb is that in the phrasal verb, that preposition cannot be separated from the verb. It has to go together as a set, or else it just wouldn't make much sense. So we would have a sentence like, we looked up that information, and we can write it as something like the second sentence, that is the information that we looked up. All right, sounds natural, right? Looked up has to go together. But if you separate it, what do you get? That is the information up which we looked. Up which we looked. See, looking up means that you go to the dictionary and you search for something. But if you separate the up with the look, like so, now it looks like the look is staring at something and you're staring in an upward direction, which is a totally different thing. So they cannot be separated. And so in this case, you really have to have that up at the end to go with the look. Okay, so this is different than saying that you can't end with a preposition, because not all prepositions are the same. So among people who study grammar, there's this famous quote. It's attributed to Winston Churchill. He was an excellent writer, as you might know, and meticulous with his grammar and everything, style, everything. So there's this report that he once said something like this about this preposition rule. He said, "This is the sort of English up with which I will not put." Okay, so what he wanted to say was put up with. I will not put up with this kind of English is what he meant to say. If you try to get that preposition up to the front, or both prepositions up to the front, you end up with this sentence, English up with which I will not put, which is ridiculous. And this is said to be just a bad rumor. Winston Churchill never did say something this awkward.